Part 6. To Catch a Predator, Understanding Pedophiles, on Understanding, Preventing, and Humanizing, considers this a more serious part of the book, on an issue that many of us refuse to ever fully engage with, a topic that is often discussed in the same breath as evil, and something that is so complicated and visceral that it warrants its own chapter. Even among criminals, it's considered so nasty that it deserves additional punishment. We are going to talk about people who are sexually attracted to children. Note that this chapter will focus on understanding why sexual attraction to children exists and how we can prevent acting on urges rather than on the important issue of the impact of child sexual abuse on victims. If you are interested in understanding those impacts, I recommend reading a 2016 review article called I Still Feel Like I'm Not Normal by Angie Kennedy and Kristen Prock, describing the self-blame, shame, and internalized stigma that female victims of child sexual abuse often experience. In 2017, Tamara Blakemore and colleagues also provided an excellent review of the impacts of child sexual abuse in religious, educational, sporting, residential, and out-of-home care settings. Better dead. There is a veritable panic in relation to pedophilia in contemporary society. We villainize, stigmatize, and ostracize those who are perceived to be pedophiles. It's not abnormal for people to openly wish upon pedophiles' horrible fates, lock them away forever, castrate them, or even kill them. A study on this perception was conducted by Sarah Janke and colleagues on German and English-speaking participants and published in 2015. They asked participants a number of questions to tap into the stigma of certain antisocial groups. They compared answers to questions about pedophiles with identical items referring to either people who abuse alcohol, sexual sadists, or people with antisocial tendencies. They found that nearly all reactions to people with pedophilia were more negative than those to the other groups. Disconcertingly, of the participants they surveyed, 14% of the German speakers and 28% of the English speakers agreed that people with pedophilia should better be dead, even if they never had committed criminal acts. The researchers concluded that these results strongly indicate that people with pedophilia are a stigmatized group who risk being the target of fierce discrimination, and that this has indirect negative consequences for preventing child abuse. When we write off rather than treat, stigmatize rather than understand, we are putting children at risk. To wish death upon pedophiles is to dehumanize them, and to fundamentally fail to engage in critical discussion regarding the treatment of child sexual abusers and the prevention of this type of sexual predation. This is particularly problematic if it's true, as a survey from 2014 found that 6% of men and 2% of women indicated some likelihood of having sex with a child if they were guaranteed they wouldn't be caught or punished. By trying to understand pedophilia, we are not dismissing the realities of child sexual abuse, nor are we condoning or normalizing the issue. Instead, we can work towards a world where we are in a better position to deal with the reality of the issue. Pedophilia has always existed and always will. Flippantly dismissing it as an aberration helps no one. Let's begin to understand pedophilia by discussing some of the basics. First, we must be careful not to confuse sexual preference with sexual predation. A diagnosis of pedophilia is made when a person is sexually attracted to children, not just because they have had indecent contact with a child. Pedophilia is a paraphilia, not a lifestyle choice. Pedophiles don't wake up one morning and decide that they are going to be sexually attracted to children, much like heteronormative men don't decide to be sexually attracted to adult women. Just they are. I will address the biological roots of a sexual attraction to children later in this chapter. Additionally, whether the person has ever acted on their urges in a criminal way is a related but separate issue. Second, we often talk about pedophile as someone who has had indecent fantasies about, indecent photos of, or indecent contact with a person who is under the legal age of consent, which is typically either 16 or 18. But this is not correct. Both socially and psychologically, there are important distinctions to be made within this age range. Pedophilia is by definition the primary or exclusive sexual interest in children who have not yet undergone puberty. Throughout this chapter, calling someone a pedophile is not an insult, it's simply a description of their sexual preference. In addition to this, there are two other categories of paraphilia that capture a sexual interest in those who are, in most countries, legally under the age of consent. Hebephiles are primarily or exclusively interested in children who have achieved puberty, usually aged 11 to 14, and ephebophiles are primarily or exclusively interested in mid to late adolescents, usually aged 15 to 19. In contrast to this, the sexual interest in fully mature adults is called teleophilia. A study comparing the characteristics of hebephiliacs and teleophiliacs concluded the hebephiliac is not more similar to the pedophile nor the teleophiliac. He is, in fact, a mix of both. Unlike pedophilia and hebephilia, ephebophilia is openly accepted, even encouraged by society. Sexualizing a 15-year-old fashion model or watching an 18-year-old porn star is quite normal. The line is drawn at different ages in different countries, but I think that most of us would accept that there is little moral difference in being attracted to someone aged 15 and 364 days on the one hand, and someone aged 16 on the other. We appear to have conflicting views, freely sexualizing teenagers because of their physical maturity, while wanting to protect them because of a lack of mental maturity. But one thing is for sure, society generally perceives those who are sexually attracted to teenagers differently to those attracted to younger children, and to some extent, they probably are different. According to research by psychologist Michael Bailey and colleagues from 2016, most men with a sexual attraction to teenage girls have a similar attraction to adult women and are not attracted to prepubescent children. According also to the clinical literature, this intuitive differentiation is appropriate. One of those three diagnoses, the two that are the most damning, are pedophilia and hebephilia. Researchers Ian McPhail and colleagues who study the diagnosis of pedophiles explained in a 2017 review that the term they use, pedohebephilia, includes both pedophilia and hebephilia. Further, they explain that as far as risk goes, theories of sexual offending include pedohebephilic interests as a main risk factor for the perpetration of sexual offenses against children. Because of this difference, and because it's often considered a more devastating diagnosis, I'm going to focus in this chapter on the pedohebephilia, using the word as McPhail does to refer to people who are interested in pubescent and pubescent children. How many pedohebephiles are there? Estimating prevalence is a difficult task, as many people are unwilling to accept or admit that they have a sexual interest in children. According to the UK National Crime Agency (NCA), as many as 1 in 35 adult men in Britain have a sexual interest in children, which is just under 3%. This means that just in the UK, the NCA believes that there are about 750,000 men who have a sexual interest in children, with 250,000 having pedohebephilic tendencies. Statistically, it's highly likely that you have at some point in the past year interacted with someone who is sexually attracted to children. This was echoed by a statement made by Phil Gormley, then Deputy Director of the NCA. If these numbers are accurate, the reality is that we are all living not far away from one. Although this quote helps illustrate the prevalence of this reality, it also makes it sound like there are monsters living around the corner, a sentiment that is destructive and one that has very problematic connotations. Does this apply to other parts of the world? In 2014, Michael Seto, a Canadian researcher who has studied how many men have sexual thoughts or fantasies about children around the world, placed the figure for pedohebephilia at 2% of the general population. However, he also stressed that much of this is due to the conclusion of hebephilia, the 11 to 14 range, and that is, if we only include pedophilia, the prevalence is probably much lower than 1%. Whichever statistic we accept, there are a lot of men who have a sexual interest in children. While far less researched and understood, There are also women and people who do not identify as gender binary who have pedophilic interests. Although the prevalence of this seems to be far lower than for men, although we don't know how many would meet the criteria for pedophilia, and many are never convicted, nevertheless, there are many female child sexual abusers. Based on a 2015 examination of virtually every substantiated child sexual abuse case reported to Child Protective Services in the U.S. for 2010, researcher David McLeod found that 20.9% of cases involved a female primary perpetrator. This proportionally high figure is partially due to cases where there were both a male and female primary offender. These are astonishing findings that challenge the public perception that only men are pedophiles. In this research, female perpetrators were particularly likely to be the biological parent of the victim, and in 68% of cases the victims were also female. Notable as a possible sign of pedophilic interest, McLeod found that over half of victims were under the age of 10, on average being 9.43 years old. This is younger than the average for female perpetrators. According to McLeod, the underrepresentation of female in the academic literature is due to mostly societal failure to recognize women as offenders. As a result, they often avoid detection, prosecution, and interventions like tracking, registration, or mandated treatment. Society and research must focus more efforts on understanding female child sex offenders. Also of note is that many men and women with pedophilic interests are married to age-appropriate partners and have sexual relations with them. Indeed, from a broader perspective and perhaps counterintuitively, paraphilias can be compatible with also having sexual desires that are not paraphilic. In a study from 2016, Michael Bailey and colleagues surveyed 1,189 men recruited from websites targeting adults attracted to children. They wanted to see whether the men were exclusively attracted to children. They found that 13.6% of those attracted to girls and 5.4% of those attracted to boys also had a sexual preference for adults. More broadly, the researchers found that many men who were primarily attracted to children were attracted to people of various ages, but with decreasing intensity as the target moved further away from the preferred age. For example, a man might be most attracted to 12-year-old girls, less attracted to 16-year-old girls, and only somewhat attracted to 22-year-old women. Nevertheless, this provides evidence that a sexual interest in children doesn't necessarily preclude a sexual interest in adults. Another common misconception is that if someone has a sexual attraction to children, their urges are uncontrollable. This is a flawed argument. Just because someone has legally and socially unacceptable urges doesn't mean that they cannot inhibit themselves. If our legal system is to be believed, humans have the capacity to decide to act in line with social and legal norms, regardless of their proclivities. Luckily, according to the NCA, 2/3 of men with pedophilic urges will probably never act on them. These are referred to as non-offending pedophiles. According to James Cantor and Ian McPhail, non-offending pedophiles are a unique population of individuals who experience sexual interest in children, but despite common misperceptions, they have neither had sexual contact with a child nor have accessed illegal child sexual exploitation material. How difficult it must be to live with the burden, to silently suffer, knowing that telling anyone about it could lead to social isolation and additional suffering. Child sex offender doesn't equal a pedophile. Unfortunately, not all pedophiles do control their ages. When acted upon, they can cause tremendous suffering. However, the relationship between having a paraphilic interest in children and sexual offending against children is complicated, and discussions about this critical issue are often fraught with errors and misperceptions. In order to better discuss the issue of sexual offenses against children, here are a few things we need to understand. Number 1. Not all child sex offenders are pedophiles, and not all pedophiles are child sex offenders. As a society, we must stop using the term sexual offender and pedophile, or even pedophile, as if they were synonyms. Doing so loses important nuance and helps to other sex offenders making it much more difficult to develop strategies to prevent offending or reoffending. It also disregards the reasons why children are sexually abused. Put simply, someone who is a pedophile might never commit a sexual offense against a child, and someone who commits sexual offenses against children might not be a pedophile. While sexual attraction to children is a risk factor for sexually offending against children, an even bigger risk factor is an individual's belief system. In particular, two cognitive distortions are predictive of someone sexually offending against a child. According to a study of child sex offenders by Ruthman and colleagues in 2005, the first belief is that sex with children is harmless, and the second is that children actively provoke adults into having sex with them. Such beliefs are used to justify sexual offenses against children, and can be held by those who have a primary sexual interest in children or by opportunistic offenders. Opportunistic offenders are those individuals who are sexually attracted to adults but have taken advantage of the ease of access or vulnerability of children to commit sexual offenses, including within the family or the church or other organized settings. This brings me to the next point. 2. Child sex offenders are typically not strangers. In a summary of misperceptions of child sex offenders, criminologist Kelly Richards argues that, although parents often fear that strangers will abuse their children, it has been well documented that most child sex offenders are known to their victims. Reviews of the literature suggest that, globally, 18 to 20% of women and 7 to 8% of men report that they were sexually abused before the age of 18, and according to a survey of children by the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children (NSPCC), 1 in 20 children in the UK have been sexually abused. Adults known to the child, including relatives, neighbors, or family friends, were the most common perpetrators. The most common offender, targeting both boys and girls, was a male relative who was not the victim's father. Number 3. Most perpetrators of child sexual abuse were not themselves sexually abused. The belief in a cycle of child sexual abuse is particularly accepted as dogma. The assumption is that those who have experienced child sexual abuse have either internalized the idea that sexual contact between children and adults is acceptable, or that they are psychologically damaged in such a way as to inhibit good decision making. However, there is little empirical evidence to support this claim. Most of those who were abused as children don't go on to become perpetrators. This is particularly true for female offenders, and most of those who sexually abuse children don't themselves have a history of being sexually abused. That being said, people who experience childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, or neglect are at an increased risk for crime and delinquency, including sexual offending. It's valuable to understand the link between being victimized and becoming a perpetrator in this context, but we must not overstate it. Number 4. Many who watch child pornography online never offend sexually against children offline, a relevant illegal act that we have not discussed in this consumption of child pornography. Because detection and reporting are incredibly difficult, it's often impossible to know exactly how many images an offender has accessed before or after a conviction. This, in addition to underreporting by victims, makes it difficult to study the link between child pornography consumption and sexual offending against children. Still, what do we know about the link? In 2015, a meta-analysis was published by public safety researcher Kelly Babson on the characteristics of online and offline sex offenders against children. About 1 in 8 convicted child pornography offenders have a recorded contact offense against a child, and when asked, about 1 in 2 self-report committing a contact offense. A contact offense involves meeting with a child and engaging in any kind of sexual or sexualized conduct. Additionally, as far as the reconviction rates go, they were found to be lower for child pornography offenses than for child sex offenders, although those who had been convicted of both porn and contact offenses were most likely to reoffend. Overall, findings showed that offenders who restricted their offending behavior to online child pornography offenses were different from mixed offenders those with both child pornography and contact sex offenses against children, and offline sex offenders against children. Those who were caught with child porn and hadn't committed contact offenses were more likely to have victim empathy. They were more likely to understand and empathize with the pain they would cause if they committed a contact offense against a child. According to the authors, victim empathy is a known barrier to sexual offending. This is important. Although child pornography consumption is a strong indicator that a person is a pedohebephile and is an even stronger predictor of being diagnosed with pedohebephilia than sexually abusing children, those who have high victim empathy often never sexually offend against a child. It seems that the ability to inhibit behavior and relate to potential victims in the face of sexual urges towards children is the most important factor that prevents pedohebephiles from being sex offenders. But what makes someone a pedohebephile in the first place? Do they choose to be this way? Born this way. As far back as 1886, German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who coined the term pedophilia, argued that it was a neurological disorder. Since then, our ability to substantiate this has grown significantly. According to James Cantor, who has peered into the brains of pedophiles for years, pedophilia is something that we are essentially born with, doesn't appear to change over time, and it's as core to our being as any other sexual orientation is. Cantor and colleagues use a humanizing approach, taking away the blame for pedohebephilic urges as opposed to acting on those urges from the individual and placing it firmly within biology. Cantor's main line of research shows that some unexpected physical characteristics are related to pedohebephilia. These include: number 1, height. Pedohebephiles have been found to be about 2 centimeters shorter than non-pedohebephiles. Number 2, handedness. Pedohebephiles are 3 times more likely to be left-handed. 3, IQ. Pedohebephiles generally have lower IQ. 4, brain wiring. Pedohebephiles generally have less gray matter and different brain connections. What do all these things have in common? They are thought to be largely determined before birth. Similarly, people's sexual orientation, including in pedohebephiles, is thought to be determined before birth. As Cantor explains, it's as if in these people, when they perceive a child, it's triggering the sexual instincts instead of triggering the nurturing instincts. This is not just true when speaking of pedohebephiles, but also when comparing child sex offenders more broadly to other kinds of sex offenders. In a 2014 meta-analysis, Christian Joyo and colleagues found that sex offenders against children on average show more neuropsychological deficits than do sex offenders against adults or peers. This means that brains of child sex offenders work differently to the brains of other kinds of sex offenders. Along the same vein, the researchers found that the IQ of child sex offenders was generally lower than those who sexually offended against adults. More precisely, they found that the more intelligent a child sex offender was, the older his victims were. This means that those who offended against very young children generally had the lowest IQs. This is not to say that environment is irrelevant. Sexual offending against children by pedohebephiles is correlated with many social factors, including poor interpersonal skills, isolation, low self-esteem, fear of rejection, lack of assertiveness, feelings of inadequacy, and a lack of sexual knowledge. Most of these are socially influenced characteristics and feelings that are strongly linked with upbringing and other environmental factors. But it seems that in the nature-nurture argument, nurture may only be relevant for the expression of pedohebephilia, the commission of child sex offenses. In other words, how someone is raised may impact how they can control their urges, but may have little to do with whether someone is sexually attracted to children in the first place. As Cantor states, even among pedophiles who never commit any offense, the condition requires lifelong suppression and control. The ability to suppress and control is probably, at least in part, the result of a better working brain and good upbringing and social support later in life. Based on the relatively limited research on this, it seemed that Pedohebiphilia is something an individual is born with, and the desire probably cannot be cured. It also means that paraphilia of being sexually attracted to children, as opposed to the acting upon these urges, probably cannot be prevented by how they are raised or socialized. What are the implications for this of the treatment? A call to humanize. Wondering what it must like to be a pedophile, psychologist Jenny Hilton asked pedophiles about their lives and published her findings in 2016. She found that many of the pedophiles she interviewed struggled with acknowledging pedophilic interests in early puberty and experienced psychological difficulties as a result. She further found that many committed sex offenses during adolescence when they were still discovering their feelings, and stated that this was probably partially because of a lack of recognition of early risk factors and a lack of appropriate intervention. She paints a bleak portrait of the pedohebiphiles she interviewed, and ends by suggesting that we need to do something to help people in these situations. We need to help them because they are human beings who are suffering, and we need to help them because they are at risk of causing great suffering to others. Her take-home message is that risk for offending can be diminished by creating more openness about pedophilia and by providing pedophiles with social support and control. If these interests have an innate genetic root beyond any individual's control, can we really call them evil? And how can we help those of us who have this sexual preference? There have been a number of initiatives to decrease the possibility that pedohebiphiles will become offenders, including sex offenders, helplines, and psychological therapy. Both of these generally aim to help manage their desires rather than to cure them. Anonymous pedohebiphilia helplines and communities are becoming more available, as we realize ever more that in order to prevent child sex offending, we must both encourage victims and those with the predispositions to speak out. Shunning and ostracizing pedohebiphiles doesn't prevent them from acting on their urges and may well be counterproductive. Initiatives have popped up, such as Stop It Now in the UK, Virtuous Pedophiles in the US, and Project Dungfield in Germany, translation Darkfield, all of which aim to provide an outlet, while providing psychological support to prevent individuals from acting on urges. Similarly, although most therapy for pedohebiphilia happens after people have committed a crime, there are initiatives that aim to preventively approach the issue. While scarce, some clinics are beginning to offer psychological support for those who have sexual fantasies involving children and who fear that they might act on them. But in many countries, this is difficult, as people may want help but fear that their doctor or therapist will tell the police. There is reasonable fear that strict confidentiality could in some cases fail to prevent harm. However, some therapists argue that in order for this system to work, there needs to be a guarantee of strict confidentiality. This approach is hugely controversial. If someone were to tell a doctor that they are currently abusing a child, both the police and the community would reasonably feel that they need to know. But from a harm reduction perspective, it's probably better that the pedohepiphile is able to talk to someone about their urges or acts rather than being completely isolated. Only in this way can they get help dealing with their urges and help to avoid acting on them. While hotlines for pedohepiphiles often promise anonymity over the phone, the German project Dungfield takes this a step further. They are the only organization worldwide, as far as I know, that allows complete anonymity to those they meet in person. Pitya Schumann, a psychologist who worked with Project Dungfield, encourages some of those who call their anonymous hotline to attend their therapy sessions. She was interviewed about her experiences in 2015. She emphasized that those who contact such projects are brave and say that they are relieved to finally have someone to talk to. Realizing that you are a pedohepiphile can be a traumatic experience in itself. She believed that pedohepiphilia is akin to disease and stated that the goal of the program is for individuals to learn how to live responsibly with their sexual desires rather than to cure the underlying paraphilia. The psychological therapy that they offer aims to help people learn how to control their urges and to extinguish certain beliefs they may hold, such as that children are sexually interested in them or want to have sex. It is so that decreasing these beliefs decreases the risk of offending. While hotlines and therapy show great promise in reducing child sexual offending, the long-term results are largely unknown. Still, at the very least, I see it as a positive to humanize pedohebiphiles and encourage them to deal with their urges rather than suppress, ignore, or act upon them. As one pedohebiphile who participated in the Dunfield therapy said in an interview with the BBC, "I don't have greedy hair, pebble glasses, and wear tatty clothes. There is no such thing as a typical pedophile who people imagine. We are all different and completely normal people. The only thing we all have in common is a sexual attraction to children. I'm learning to control the sexual side of my feelings." There is another way in which pedohebiphilia might be dealt with that is also controversial: castration. Physical castration involves surgically removing the testicles. Although optional physical castration for sex offenders is still available in Germany and the Czech Republic, it has been heavily criticized by the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment and has generally fallen out of favor since the 1940s when chemical castration was introduced. Chemical castration is a type of treatment for pedohebiphilic men, typically those who have already offended, which involves the regular injection of anti-androgen drugs. These drugs temporarily remove sex drives and make it almost impossible to get an erection. In some countries, chemical castration is optional, while in others, like Poland, Indonesia, the Czech Republic, Australia, Korea, and parts of the US, it can be mandated for convicted sex offenders. Particularly, the mandatory use of these drugs has been widely criticized on the humanitarian grounds. Additionally, as psychiatrists Don Grubin and Anthony Beach state, there is an argument that doctors should avoid becoming agents of social control. But at a very basic level, does castration even work? Research on both physical and chemical castration actually shows some promising results. Doctors in Germany and the Czech Republic have argued that those who choose physical castration voluntarily see more positive results, and they can control their urges easier than the chemical castration. Proponents of chemical castration equally suggest that they see positive results. However, some researchers, including Alexandra Lewis, advise us to be cautious with such findings. After reviewing the literature on chemical castration for sex offenders in 2017, Lewis' results show that overall benefits were seen, with decreased desire and decreased acting on desires, but that the quality of research is not good enough to draw firm conclusions. According to physician Fred Berlin, some people with pedohebiphilia can benefit from chemical castration, but he warns that current evidence shows this to be the case only when the drug is administered voluntarily. He reminds us that currently there are no medications that can change sexual orientation. Pharmacological treatments only can lower intensity of unacceptable sex urge. Pedophilia cannot be punished or legalized away. It's much a public health problem as it's a matter of criminal justice. Paraphilias live in the brain, not in the genitals or hormones. Medical intervention doesn't cure pedohebiphiles, it can merely make their urges less intense. Another type of controversial harm reduction approach involves using substitutes for real children. What if an individual with pedohebiphilic tendencies could satisfy their urges without ever having to harm a child? There are a few avenues through which this could happen, all of which are deeply uncomfortable for many people. There is the production of pornography with adults who are made to look like they are children or teenagers. Other approaches avoid humans altogether and involve sexualized computer-generated children or hentai, Japanese animated porn, realistic child sex dolls, and not so distant future child sex robots. At the moment, in most countries, rules about obscene images limit or ban the legal distribution of any of these materials. Indeed, in 2017, a man in the UK tried to import a child sex doll, and a judge ruled that such dolls were obscene items and therefore forbidden from being imported. Fake children have the potential to act as replacements for real children, reducing harm to society and allowing pedohebiphiles to live more meaningful and ethical lives. But they also have the potential for those individuals who consume these materials to normalize their reflection and lead to more offending behavior. This would be in line with what we understand about pornography more generally. Having a child sex doll is similar in at least some respects towards child pornography, and from previous research we have identified watching child pornography as a risk factor for engaging in contact offenses against children. So, child sex dolls may well disinhibit pedophilic individuals and make them more likely to offend. Another third possible outcome is that such materials make no difference at all. Based on what we know so far, all of these alternatives seem equally likely. This makes it difficult to make appropriate treatment decisions and mean that there is immediate and urgent need for research on these issues. Whether it is psychological treatment, castration, child sex dolls, our focus should be on realistic harm reduction, not just punishment. As new technologies and treatment options emerge, the ethical discussions around what we do as a society to help deal with the realities of pedohebephilia must continue. We must not be driven by our fears in this process of renegotiating how we as individuals and as society deal with those who have a sexual interest in children. Pedohebephiles are a permanent fixture of human societies, and a larger part than we might imagine. They are our friends and colleagues, neighbors and nephews, fathers and sons, and occasionally mothers, daughters, and aunties. By acknowledging this, we can ensure that our focus remains on harm reduction, trying to make sure that as few individuals as possible become perpetrators. Even if many would suggest that their actions are evil, pedohebephiles are not monsters, they are human beings. They were born with unacceptable sexual tendencies, they didn't choose to have them. This is a call to stop beliefs, policies, and therapies that suggest otherwise. Until now, we have focused largely on the individuals within society who are seen as evil. It's time that we expand into the systems that make it easier, even likely that will do terrible things. We turn our attention now to the corrupting influences of money and the moral gymnastics that some of us do every day at work. And this concludes part 6.